The summer had just begun, and the two brothers, Ethan and Jake, were excited to spend it at their grandmother's house. Nestled deep in the countryside, the house was a picturesque retreat, surrounded by lush forests and rolling hills. Their parents were busy with work and had decided to send the boys to their grandmother's for a month. "Think of it as an adventure," their father had said. "You'll have plenty of space to explore." The boys loved their grandmother, a sweet old woman with a heartwarming smile. Her house, a quaint two-story building with a sprawling garden and an ancient stone well, was like something out of a fairy tale. They arrived on a warm, sunny afternoon, greeted by the scent of blooming flowers and the distant chirping of birds. "Welcome, my darlings," their grandmother, whom they called Nana, exclaimed as she enveloped them in a hug. "I've baked your favorite cookies." Ethan, the older of the two at 14, grinned and grabbed a cookie. Jake, 2 years younger and always the more cautious one, followed suit, his eyes darting around the familiar yet slightly eerie surroundings. "Are you boys ready for some fun?" Nana asked, her eyes twinkling. "Yes," they chorused, though Jake's enthusiasm was more subdued. He couldn't shake the feeling that there was something different about the house this year, something that made his skin prickle. The days passed pleasantly. The boys spent their time playing in the garden, helping Nana with chores and exploring the nearby woods. At night they would sit by the fireplace, listening to Nana's stories about her childhood. But as night fell on their first Friday there, things began to change. It started with a sound, a faint, rhythmic rustling coming from the garden. Ethan was the first to notice it as he lay in bed, staring at the ceiling. "Do you hear that?" he whispered to Jake, who was in the bed next to him. Jake strained his ears. "Yeah, what is it?" Ethan shrugged. "Probably just an animal." They tried to ignore it, but the sound persisted, growing louder and more distinct. It was as if someone, or something, was walking through the garden, brushing against the bushes. Ethan, always the brave one, got out of bed and went to the window. He peered out into the darkness but saw nothing. "I can't see anything," he said, returning to his bed. "Let's just go to sleep." But sleep did not come easily that night. The rustling continued for hours, filling their minds with uneasy thoughts. The next morning, over breakfast, Ethan and Jake mentioned the noises to Nana. "Oh, that's probably just the wind," she said dismissively, though her eyes flickered with something the boys couldn't quite place. "This old house has its quirks." Satisfied with her explanation, Ethan and Jake went about their day, but the memory of the strange sounds lingered. That evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon, they found themselves drawn to the old stone well at the far end of the garden. It had always been a source of fascination for them, with its moss-covered stones and the dark yawning mouth that seemed to beckon them closer. "I dare you to look down," Ethan challenged Jake, a mischievous grin on his face. Jake shook his head. "No way, you do it." Ethan laughed and leaned over the edge, peering into the darkness. "There's nothing down there," he said, though he couldn't shake the feeling that something was staring back at him from the inky blackness. That night, the rustling in the garden returned, louder and more persistent than before. The boys tried to ignore it, but it was impossible. They lay awake, hearts pounding, until the first light of dawn crept through their window. A few nights later the noises escalated. It was no longer just rustling. Now there were footsteps, heavy, deliberate footsteps that crunched on the gravel path and moved closer to the house. The boys huddled together in their bed, too frightened to move. Suddenly, Jake felt a cold shiver run down his spine. He turned to Ethan, his voice trembling. "I feel like someone's watching us." Ethan, trying to be brave, got out of bed and approached the window. His heart raced as he pulled back the curtain. Standing in the garden, partially obscured by the shadows, was a figure. It was tall and thin, with elongated limbs and a pale, gaunt face. Its eyes, dark and hollow, seemed to bore into Ethan's soul. Ethan stumbled back, his breath coming in ragged gasps. "Jake, get away from the window," he whispered urgently. Jake, now completely terrified, did as he was told. "What did you see?" he asked, his voice barely audible. Ethan shook his head, unable to speak. The image of the creature was burned into his mind, a nightmarish vision that refused to fade. The next morning, the boys decided to tell Nana everything. They described the noises, the footsteps, and the terrifying figure in the garden. Nana listened quietly, her face growing pale. When they finished, she sighed deeply. "I was hoping you wouldn't have to know," she said softly. "There's something I need to tell you." She led them to the living room and took a seat, motioning for them to sit beside her. "This house is old, very old. And with age comes history. Some of that history is not pleasant." Nana explained that many years ago, a tragedy had occurred on the property. A young man, driven mad by grief and anger, had thrown himself into the well. His restless spirit, unable to find peace, now haunted the garden. "But why is he here now?" Ethan asked, his voice shaking. Nana shook her head. "I don't know, but I do know that we need to leave. It's not safe here anymore." The boys nodded, relief washing over them. They packed their bags quickly, eager to escape the house that had become a place of nightmares. Their parents were due to pick them up the next morning, so they spent one last night in the house. Nana insisted that they all sleep in the same room for safety. They barricaded the door and kept a flashlight handy, but sleep was elusive. In the early hours of the morning, Ethan awoke with a start. The room was eerily silent. He glanced at the window and froze. The creature was there again, its hollow eyes staring at him through the glass. Paralyzed with fear, Ethan could only watch as the figure moved closer, pressing its face against the window. Its mouth opened, revealing sharp, jagged teeth, and it let out a low, guttural growl. Ethan's scream woke Jake and Nana. They turned to see the horrifying figure at the window and screamed as well. Nana grabbed the flashlight and shone it at the creature, but it didn't move. Instead, it raised a bony hand and pointed directly at Ethan. "We have to go, now!" Nana shouted. She grabbed the boys and they bolted from the room, racing down the stairs and out the front door. The night air was cool and crisp as they ran through the garden, the creature's growl echoing behind them. They didn't stop until they reached the edge of the property where their parents were just arriving. "What's going on?" their father asked, alarmed by their terrified expressions. "There's no time to explain," Nana said urgently. "We need to leave." They piled into the car and sped away, leaving the house and the creature behind. As they drove away, Ethan glanced back and saw the figure standing at the edge of the garden, watching them with its hollow eyes. Ethan and Jake never returned to their grandmother's house. Nana sold the property and moved closer to their parents. The boys tried to put the experience behind them, but the memory of the creature haunted their dreams. Years later, Ethan did some research and discovered that their grandmother's story was true. The well had indeed been the site of a tragic death, and the restless spirit had been sighted by others over the years. Ethan and Jake would never forget the summer they spent at their grandmother's house, nor the terrifying creature that had watched them from the garden. It was a lesson they would carry with them forever. Some places are haunted by more than just memories.